So welcome everyone to this IPT online lecture on queering peacebuilding with Dr. Henri Myrttinen. I'm really excited to share in this conversation with you all today on sexual orientation, on gender identity and expression within the context of peacebuilding. Before we dive into it, I do want to say just a few words, especially for those joining us for the first time. This conversation and lecture series is hosted by the ASPR, the Austrian Study Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, where we envision a world in which people with different backgrounds and circumstances are willing and able to recognize and address conflicts by nonviolent, constructive and sustainable means. We do so through accompanying conflict parties directly through training, research and education. My name is Julia Scharinger. I'm a program manager here at the ASPR, and I have the pleasure of accompanying you throughout the series. So thank you so much for showing up with us in this way. I do want to call into this conversation that we all come from different lived experiences, from questions, concerns, expectations. So we really want to invite you to join this lecture in a spirit of curiosity, of generosity, and the assumption as well as commitment of good intent. It's really a place where we invite all of us to show up as our kindest, most courageous and robust selves to conversations which I'm sure many of us hold very close to our hearts and which may require care and gentleness just as much as rigor and reflexivity. And with that, it's my absolute honor to introduce you to today's lecturer, Dr. Henri Myrttinen. Henri is a lead associate with Gender Associations, a Berlin-based company. He has over 15 years of experience of researching and working on issues of gender, peace and security, and he also holds a Ph.D. in conflict resolution and peace studies. I was very fortunate to come across Henri's work when I was living and working in Timor-Leste, and I really have to say that it has shaped a lot of my work, my thinking around peace building, around gender identity, far beyond Timor as well. So it's a really great personal pleasure to be able to share this conversation with you, Henri, and I wish for all of us that you find it as meaningful and enticing as I did and still do. So thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours, Henri.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this online lecture. I'll start off with a bit of background to this lecture. So my name is Henri Myrttinen. I'm currently in Yangon, so I hope the technicalities of this lecture will work out fine. But I have been working on these issues around sexual orientation and gender identity and conflict and peace building for about 5 to 8 years now, and it started out when I was working for another organization, a UK-based peace building organization called International Alert, where we did a multi-country study looking at how gender is being looked at and worked on in peace building. And one thing we found was that there was a massive gap around any kind of work or policies or even thinking about how persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities, LGBTI persons, how they experience conflict, how they experience displacement, and how these experiences can then be addressed in peace-building efforts. So that initial piece of research, which was looking at Nepal, Colombia, Burundi, and Uganda, then led to a second project where we then looked at these issues in more detail in a couple of countries. So in Colombia, which I will be talking about, in Lebanon, Syria, which I will also be using as a case study example, and in Nepal and in the Balkans, but also looking at kind of like taking a general global overview of what the issues are. Since then, I've sort of continued working on this issue in different kinds of ways. So I'm no longer with International Alert, but I've been involved with one of the Lebanese partner organizations, Mosaic Mina, in doing more research in Lebanon and in Syria, looking at the experiences of LGBTI persons how they've been affected by conflict and by displacement. So my presentation is called, as you can see, Queering, Peacebuilding, Sexual Orientation, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity in Peacebuilding. And what I'll do is start off with some of the terminology first, because there's it can be a bit confusing because there's a lot of different kinds of terms which are used. There's a lot of different acronyms which are used, and there isn't really one single good term or any good acronym that encompasses everything. So I'll take you through some of the most common ones here. So especially in the global north, in the Western world, one set of acronyms that you see a lot is different variations of LGBT, LGBTI, LGBTIQ, LGBTIQ+, and so on, referring to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer, and other identities. And this is something that has been taken up a lot by the LGBTIQ rights organizations in the global north especially, and to an extent in global south societies as well, but it's not uncontested. One of the issues that we ran very early on in the research in Colombia, and thank you to the person who just posted a reference to some research on Colombia. One of the things we ran into quite early on was that some of the LGBTIQ rights activists, or the trans activists especially, felt that this was very much Western and North American terminology that didn't reflect their identities well and their experiences. It is also something that in other countries has then also been used, by many governments, is seen as something quite threatening, especially more conservative governments, such as the Vatican or European governments like Croatia or Hungary or Poland. And there's been a lot of mobilization against LGBTI, LGBTIQ as a term. So one way around this has then been this use of the term diverse sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions, and sometimes the SC there, the sex characteristics. And this is something that comes out of the context of the UN Human Rights Council, where there was a lot of resistance to language around LGBTI, LGBTIQ. So instead, there are references to SOGIE rights, so sexual orientation, gender identity rights, for example, because that's something that you cannot really critique, because sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expressions, sex characteristics, that's something that every person has. And rights related to that are something that cannot really be questioned by homophobic, transphobic actors or governments. So that has some benefits vis-a-vis use of LGBTI, but the problem is that since everybody has sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, using this term of diverse SOGIE doesn't really necessarily get to the point of what we're trying to look at, which is the experiences of very particular sexual orientations, very particular gender identities in conflict and peace building. Another term that's sometimes used, and this one's used especially in also non-English languages, for example in German, but also where I come from Finnish, is sexual and gender minorities. And in some cases, that is seen as also kind of a more empowering term to use, because that then builds a link really sort of through the vocabulary to minority rights issues. And that is something that some actors prefer to use. Others, however, feel that the use of the term minority is potentially pejorative. So it's also not ideal in that sense. So Western academia and Western LGBTI rights organizations and movements, what one sees a lot more nowadays is the use of queer terminology, which is something that isn't, there is no one definition for that, but it is also something that's outside of academia and outside of the global north, Western context is also often seen as something that is not representative of, let's say, global south identities and practices and orientations. So it is something that's very much seen as quite Western, and also seen by some people as being a bit too radical for what it is that they're standing for. Another set of terms that's come up in recent years a lot more is using cisgender and transgender. So transgender refers to persons who are who feel that they are not of the gender that was assigned to them at birth, whereas cisgender means that you are okay kind of with the gender identity that you were assigned with at birth. And that's sometimes misunderstood to kind of use cisgender as a synonym for heterosexuality, which it isn't. So you can have cisgender gay men, for example, who are men who are born men, assigned the male gender at birth, and they're happy to be men, or lesbian women who are cisgender. So this is a kind of term or division that then makes trans identities clearer, but then doesn't really go into sexual orientations. Trans persons can also be of all sorts of sexual orientations, and it's not necessarily only one. Something that we then also ran into in our research, especially some of the more recent research we've been doing with Mosaic in Lebanon, Syria, and the Middle East region broadly, is this question around identity versus practice. So the LGBTI terminology, queer terminology, to an extent, sexual orientation, gender identity, vocabulary and terminology focuses on Western concepts of identity. That a key part of that is that you are gay, or that you're lesbian, or you're transgender, whereas for a lot of our respondents, that was not necessarily a key part of their identity. They would identify as, let's say, Lebanese and Sunni Muslim, or as Palestinian, or as Christian or Shia, or belonging to a particular party, or secular, and that was a much more important part of their identity. And what they do as a practice, as having sex with men having sex with men, women having sex with women, for example, that's seen as something as practice that does not impact on their identity. So this linking of sexual orientation with identity is also something that's often seen as a more Western imposition in some cases. And missing from a lot of these conversations, and I'll talk a bit more about that later as well, are then non-Western identities and practices which exist in various kinds of forms in societies across the planet. So these terms around LGBTI, LGBTIQ, for example, or queer identities don't necessarily take into account the various identities that are there in Latin American societies, in indigenous societies, and in African societies, Asian societies, or even traditional European gender practices and identities. So that's definitely also an area that we need to be careful with when talking about non-Western societies in this context. Also, then linking a bit to the identity versus practice question is then how do we bring in experiences of men who have sex with men but do not identify as gay or as bisexual, or women who have sex with women who don't identify as lesbian or bisexual. And then also the question of what do you do with people who do not identify as gay or as lesbian or bisexual. They identify as being straight, but others think that they are too effeminate as men or too masculine as women, and thereby become targets of violence, which is homophobic violence or biphobic violence, transphobic violence. But they themselves do not identify as gay or lesbian or any other of these diverse SOGIE identities. So in a sense, then lumping them in with LGBTI experiences, even though the violence is homophobic, does a disservice to them, because that is then just reinforcing the sense that only certain ways of being a man or certain ways of being a woman are actually accepted as, or acceptable as, straight masculinities or straight femininities. So that's a lot there, and I'm happy to talk more about that and go into more detail. But I mean, it can be a bit confusing, and there is no one single all-encompassing term that is functioning or works for every context. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be using mostly diverse SOGIE and LGBTIQ. But when you do this kind of work, please be aware of some of these complexities. This is a question which came up very much at the beginning of our research, and occasionally does also come up when discussing these kinds of issues, is some peace-building actors, some conflict actors raise the question of why should we do this? Why should we even be looking at LGBTI persons or diverse SOGIE in the context of peace building? Because this is such a minor issue or a side issue. It's just a minority group that's being affected. And kind of the arguments that I would raise against that kind of narrow framing of gender in peace building is that first of all, taking a sort of a peace building approach, that we are concerned about the human rights of everyone in a conflict situation, and that means also looking at some of the often most egregious human rights issues or violations are the ones which are being committed against LGBTI persons, against persons of diverse SOGIE. And that is, as I will be talking about later, often a factor that really increases vulnerabilities that other people affected by conflict don't have. It is also an issue of inclusive peace, and peace-building organizations, peace-building actors do often talk about wanting to build an inclusive peace, and that means that it has to be inclusive. It cannot be then exclusive of a particular group of people or particular identities, but it's something that does need to then take into account everyone in society. Especially, and again, this is something that as peace-building organizations, institutions, and actors, we tend to highlight, is that we want to protect the most vulnerable. And some of the people that fall under the umbrella of diverse SOGIE or LGBTI identities are definitely amongst the most vulnerable groups and individuals in a conflict situation. But also in non-conflict situations. So if you look at some of the statistics, and there's seldom very good statistics, but there are indicative statistics that one can find. So for example, in a place like New Orleans in the US, which is a city at peace, the life expectancy of Afro-American trans women is about half of that of the rest of the population, and we can find similar figures in places like El Salvador as well, where the life expectancy, because of the particular vulnerabilities faced by trans persons, but also in some cases lesbian women, gay men, bisexual persons, put them in a position of extreme vulnerability. So if we do want to say that we are protecting or taking the needs of the most vulnerable into account, then this has to have a diverse SOGIE perspective in our work. But kind of taking a step back from that and kind of looking at or thinking about it a bit more theoretically, I think looking at diverse SOGIE issues in conflict and peace building also helps understand some of the macro level gender dynamics of violence and exclusive ideologies better. So something that was really striking in the research that we did a couple of years ago, which was kind of taking a global view at diverse SOGIE experiences of conflict, is that you have actors from the extreme far right, secular right, to the extreme far secular left. You have actors from extremist groups of all major world religions mobilizing around LGBTI issues, and often linking them this with misogynist or anti-democratic or otherwise anti-minority group rhetoric, which is also something we're seeing in some of the political backlash against LGBTI groups in Latin America or Europe at the moment as well. So there is something there that works for right-wing Colombian paramilitaries, that worked for Maoist guerrillas in the Philippines and in Peru, that mobilizes hardcore Russian Orthodox Church actors as much as Islamic State actors, as much as extreme Christian groups, to mobilize around issues of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia. So I think there is something that's very salient there that we can look at to better understand some of the gender dynamics of violence and exclusionary ideologies. But it also, I think, gives us a better understanding of what happens at the micro level of violence and how that is gendered, and why it is that in conflicts, sometimes some of the most spectacular and invisible and really these spectacles of violence against suspected lesbians or suspected gay persons are very graphic and brutal, and much more so than against other persons. But it's also something that you can see on a, let's say, a Friday night in Europe, where you have a group of men attacking another man who's perceived as being too effeminate and leading to a brutal beating, or you have so-called corrective rapes of lesbian women happening in different parts of the world, to use that horrible term. So there is something also happening at the micro level that really leads to these often very extreme forms of violence against LGBTI persons. And I think for that, we need to build in this kind of a diverse SOGIE lens into our conflict analysis. So to kind of complicate the picture maybe a bit more, so one thing we also, that really came out of the work that we've been doing and the research, is that there is a need for a nuance. And oftentimes, even when there is an attempt made by well-meaning actors to take LGBTI issues into account, there is a sense that this is one homogeneous group, that it's men, women, and LGBTI, which invisibilizes the fact that some of the men in the men group are gay and bisexual, or some of the women in the women group already are lesbian, bisexual, and trans. So that there is that invisibilization happening, but also that there are very different needs and very different also interests between the lesbian women, bisexual men, gay men, trans women, trans men, and so on. And oftentimes the narrative around LGBTIQ needs and experiences has been dominated by those of gay men, especially more middle class and upper class gay men, because they have the social capital, they have the social channels, they have the possibility of speaking out and being politically active in many societies that women in general, for example, don't have, or trans persons wouldn't have. So this leads to an invisibilization of lesbian women, of bisexuals, of trans persons, and then also of intersex persons, who are often sometimes seen as a bit of an add-on also within the LGBTIQ community. And one concrete example of how these interests can be different came out also early on in the research in Colombia, where we were talking to a organization that was advocating for trans women's rights, and they highlighted that sometimes they do cooperate with the organizations that work for trans men's rights, but in other things their interests are diametrically opposed. So with the conscription that's in force in Colombia, if you're born a man, even though you are a trans woman, you are still potentially forced to join the army and do your national service in the military. So the trans women's organization was lobbying for the right to be exempt from military service. The trans men's organization, on the other hand, was lobbying for the opposite, that even though they, on their identity cards, they had been assigned woman at birth, they were now trans men and thereby should have the right to serve in the military. So completely sort of opposite political ends that they were fighting for on this issue, whereas for a lot of other issues, they would be on the same page. There's also a need for an intersectional analysis, so looking at how age, class, ethnicity, location, ability, disability affects different LGBTIQ persons, differently, and puts them into different positions of agency, power, vulnerability. So sticking maybe with the Colombian example, some of the activists that we were talking to are upper middle class, university educated, very literate, very eloquent, lesbian, gay, trans persons, and often they are of sort of Colombian European descent, and then a lot of the most marginalized groups who live in the same city but have very, very, very different experiences of vulnerability and of violence are, for example, Afro-Colombian trans sex workers who have dropped out of school and might often rely on commercial sex work and petty drug trafficking to survive, so that the needs and positions of vulnerability are often very different. As mentioned, there is very little analysis of non-Western categories when there is this use of LGBTI or diverse SOGIE terminology in policy especially. There's a little, comparatively little thinking through of practices versus identities with a focus put on these Western identity categories. And there's often an assumption that in conflict, LGBTI persons, persons of diverse SOGIE will be victims, and also that they might be more tolerant of other political and religious minorities, which is not necessarily the case. So in some of the Colombian research, for example, in looking at trans persons who have joined the paramilitaries, they share the same kind of somewhat transphobic views or homophobic views of the paramilitaries. Or in some of the research we've been doing in Lebanon, you also have xenophobia, Islamophobia, homophobia within the LGBTI community, and transphobia as well amongst some of the gay men, for example. So we shouldn't assume that because someone is of a certain sexual orientation, that equals a certain kind of political orientation. So as I mentioned, yes, there are then also these issues around misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, racism within the LGBTI spectrum as well. And oftentimes also then the experiences of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence are invisibilized. And also in this presentation, I will focus mostly on violence from persons outside of the LGBTI community on LGBTI persons. But there is also, as with any other human beings, the capacity of violence then also in same-sex couples, for example. But oftentimes there is no possibility of seeking services for that or going to accessing justice for that. So a lot of it becomes invisibilized. And also there is no uniform dynamics around acceptance of particular identities. In some societies, it is easier to be a gay man than a lesbian woman. In other societies, it's the opposite. In some societies, there's traditionally been a lot of acceptance of trans identities, but not of homosexual identities, for example. So there's a need to contextualize what the particular dynamics are in each place. So looking at then, and here's a screenshot of the report that we came out from that global research. What we found out, first of all, is that there's very little research and data on these issues, and even less policy that would be looking at diverse SOGIE issues in conflict, peace, and displacement. That's been changing to an extent. There has been a lot more discussion in, especially when it comes to the protocols for persons in displacement, coming from the UNHCR, for example, or in discussions around civil society discussions around women, peace, and security, that there's a need to have this more comprehensive understanding of gender. But when it comes to, let's say, the UN level or UN Security Council resolutions and so on, there's very little or nothing there, in part because of very high levels of resistance by particular countries. But even though there isn't this like high level policy response, or there's very little sort of research, there are a lot of grassroots responses in pretty much all societies, even though a lot of this kind of grassroots work and informal work has to happen underneath the radar screen for security reasons. As mentioned, there are these issues around terminology, which are often very important, and especially for persons and groups who have been marginalized and invisibilized, there's really a need to take these issues seriously and not just see them as something that's these people being difficult around them. Maybe this is something that is really central to a lot of the experiences of exclusion. As I mentioned, then you have these global trends of mobilization around homophobia, biphobia, transphobia that are happening in a whole variety of different kinds of institutions, organizations, and movements, regardless of their political orientation. In part, as mentioned, also sort of the lack of access to recourse around issues of violence, or even being able to report the kind of violence that's happening because of one's sexual orientation, gender identity, and the invisibilization of that by researchers, by state institutions, means that there is then this lack of data around these issues. And when there are then sort of more sympathetic actors, let's say UNHCR, for example, or the OSCE or international organizations who do say that they do want to take diverse SOGIE perspectives into account, there's often very little understanding of what that might mean in practice. And lastly, so one of the findings, and I'll get to this at the end, so we can end on a more positive note, bringing sort of these diverse SOGIE perspectives into work on peace building does also allow for new openings around these issues. So what we did find is that persons of diverse SOGIE often face a continuum of violence in terms of time and in terms of their location, and in many ways these findings then echo some of the broader feminist critiques of what war is or what violence is, in saying that there is often a spectrum, a continuum of violence that doesn't start with an armed conflict and doesn't end with the end of the armed conflict. So taking, for example, the example of Syria and Lebanon and some of the findings we got there. So the Syrian refugees who we interviewed in Lebanon had faced violence because of their sexual orientation and gender identity already prior to the conflict. And often had been moved from smaller towns into Aleppo or Damascus, where there's a bit more freedom to express themselves and live the lives they want to live, and have also informal support networks. But then as the conflict escalated, then a whole variety of different armed actors started mobilizing and using increasingly using increased levels of violence against LGBTI populations and individuals. And this then continued also in terms of time and place when they then fled to Lebanon. So they were faced with violence and extortion and discrimination on the way to the Lebanese border. They faced extortion and violence from border guards. They faced violence and extortion and risk of life when they're in the informal refugee camps in the Bekaa Valley. If and when they make it to Beirut, they face violence and rejection and discrimination for being Syrian refugees within the LGBTI community, but also from others in Beirut for being gay and for being Syrian, for being trans and for being Syrian. And even if they make it into a safe country, let's say are resettled in Europe or Canada or the US, then they might again face homophobic violence, transphobic violence, violence against them on the basis that they're Syrians, and some xenophobic racist violence as well. So I have this continuum of violence throughout time and throughout place that these persons of diverse SOGIE faced. And this violence is also something that comes from all sides. There is direct violence by armed actors of all ideological leanings, but then there's also extortion. So having to, for example, carry out sexual acts under the threat of otherwise being outed to the community. There is shaming, there is humiliation, dehumanization of the victims. There is also the use, and I'll come a bit to this in the Colombian case, the use of violence against LGBTI persons for gaining the support of the rest of the population who reject LGBTI identities. But then also using directed violence, and this is again something that we see in Colombia, direct violence against anyone who's politically active, also around SOGIE issues, as a way of stopping social mobilization more broadly. But in addition to this violence by different kinds of armed actors, by the military, by guerrillas, by paramilitaries, and so on, in a lot of societies, persons of diverse SOGIE also face violence by other civilians, by gangs, for example, in the case of Colombia or Central America, by militias, but also their very own family members, and you have honor killings of persons of diverse SOGIE. They face violence from neighbors, they face violence from other refugees, for example. And there's layers of vulnerability there. So again, sticking with the Syrian example, so a lesbian Syrian woman refugee in Lebanon, for example, is vulnerable because she is a refugee, because she is of a lower socioeconomic class and is not able to get work because of her refugee status. She's vulnerable because she is a woman in a highly patriarchal society. But if somebody finds out about her sexual orientation, then that adds a further and often more exacerbating level of vulnerability to her situation. But it's also important to see that this vulnerability is constructed. It's not something that's innate. It's not that all trans people are vulnerable because they are trans, or a lesbian woman is vulnerable because she's lesbian, but it's because we construct society as one that makes these people vulnerable, that there is discrimination at all levels, legally, socially, politically, against diverse SOGIE. And it's not something that's innate to being of diverse SOGIE, but something that we as a society construct. And a particular vulnerability that we see there is visibility, how visibly gay a man is, for example, how visibly trans someone is. And that really often heightens the degree of vulnerability and the risk of violence, that if they are able to pass as cisgender, if they're able to pass as heterosexual, then there is much less risk of violence. And something that's also very visible in the research that we did is that while we have these kind of big V forms of violence linked to the armed conflict, there's also a lot of very just everyday abuses, verbal abuses, harassment, discrimination, the looks that they get on the street when walking down the street in Bogota or Beirut or wherever, that really have a very, very strong cumulative psychosocial impact on the people that we were interviewing in this research, which also needs to be taken more seriously in peace building and not just seen as something that's a minor issue. So I'll round out the presentation by giving you a sort of quick overview of two of the case studies that we've been looking at. One is Lebanon, Syria, and the other one is Colombia. So in terms of Syria, it's obviously a very dynamic situation in terms of what's happening politically and militarily, and our own research has been so heavily impacted by that. But what we have seen is that there's violence with different forms of violence, as mentioned, so direct violence, but also extortion or blackmailing, sexual violence, and so on, against persons of diverse SOGIE. That's being perpetrated by pretty much all of the armed actors and civilians across the very diverse population of Syria. So we see Islamist groups, like hardcore Islamist groups, using this kind of violence, Islamic State or Daesh being sort of the most obvious one, but also other Islamist groups which are sort of less visibly or less virulently anti-LGBTI, but we do have that as well. In other groups, you have violence by government actors, by government militias, by the various militias supporting the government, and so on. And the one possible exception here is the Kurdish armed groups in Rojava, where unfortunately we were supposed to do some research, but then the conflict dynamics made that impossible. But it's something we do want to look at, because there is this experiment with a more comprehensive and open and gender equal situation in Rojava that might make it more open to diverse SOGIE identities as well. There's violence, especially in places of detention, and there was just a recent Human Rights Watch report that came out looking at that included research on gay men and trans women's experiences of brutal violence, sexual violence in places of detention. But what it has also done more positively in a way is that there's been more international attention to diverse issues at the international arena because of the violence, especially that was perpetrated by Islamic State. But this hasn't really been followed through. What is interesting to see is how the situation then is going to be developing in different parts of the country. So in Damascus, from our interviewees, we've heard that there's more openings and more possibilities of living out diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, whereas in Aleppo, there's still quite restrictive and sort of, even though it's controlled by the government, you have very sort of Islamist tendencies there. Idlib is heavily under the control of Islamist groups. It remains to be seen what will happen in Rojava. So very different potential dynamics happening there in different parts of the country. And there is, of course, the massive question of what will happen to those who are currently in Lebanon, in Jordan, or in Turkey, or elsewhere, who are then being forced by their host governments to return to Syria, and what that means for LGBTI populations. And it's also unpredictable what kind of shifts there will be in the social political environment, whether the Assad government, now that it's most likely going to be the victor in the war, whether they will be more open to having more open gender policies, or if there's going to be a clamping down on perceived immorality, if the Islamist influences that were there or are still there in many places, how strong those will be. So it remains to be seen what the situation will be in terms of diverse SOGIE populations. So parallel to this, we've then also been doing research in Lebanon, and Lebanon is an interesting case study for the Middle East in the sense that it's one of the most comparatively open spaces for LGBTI populations, for diverse SOGIE populations, depending on where you are. So, for example, when we launched our report in Beirut, we were able to do that in an openly LGBTI-friendly bar downtown Beirut, and that was no problem. And you had a lot of people, openly lesbian, gay, trans, bi people there. That would not have been possible about a kilometer away in the neighboring neighborhood, which is under the control of some more hardcore Shia militias, or it wouldn't have been possible in the more Sunni areas either. So there's open spaces in some parts, but also very closed spaces in others. There is an article from the French colonial era that is still in the Lebanese penal code that prohibits sort of unnatural sexual relations, which has been used against LGBTI persons in the past, but there's also been court cases where it has been decided by the judges that there's nothing unnatural about diverse SOGIE. So that is kind of a fluctuating situation. The country has a massive refugee population of Syrians, Palestinians, Iraqis, Egyptians, and a lot of LGBTI persons from other parts of the Arab world have come to Beirut because it's seen as a comparatively more open space. But within the LGBTI community, and I put that in quotation marks because it's not, there's a lot of divisions there as well. You have layers of discrimination between, let's say, Lebanese and Palestinians, Lebanese and Syrians, between gay men and trans women, and so on, between different religious orientation sects and between secular ones. So there are a lot of tensions within that community as well. And these have then also been heavily impacted by the political turmoil of the past couple months or over a year by now, by the massive economic crisis, and now also by COVID-19, which is especially impacting some of the populations which are heavily reliant on working in the streets, be it in the informal economy or as commercial sex workers. On a positive note, especially sort of the influx of Syrian refugees and the need to have a more diverse SOGIE friendly response to LGBTI refugees has meant that a lot of the service providers, NGOs, government, to an extent also the police, have become more aware, more open to these kinds of issues. Moving on to the next slide with Colombia. So Colombia is in many ways, a very different kind of situation, but also with some similarities. And like Lebanon, like Syria, it's a very diverse society, and again, highlighting the need for intersectionality, especially in looking at different locations and looking at different populations, like what are the particular dynamics for persons of diverse SOGIE who are indigenous or Afro-Colombian, who live in the bigger cities or who live in the countryside. It is a society with a very active civil society and to a relatively high degree also state support for working on these issues. That it's not one of the countries, at least not yet, where there is a massive clampdown on LGBTI organizing, as in some of the other countries in Latin America. But there are also powerful conservative actors who are mobilizing around against LGBTI issues as well. But for the moment, there is some degree of state support for diversity and equality. There is also then, as I mentioned earlier, the 60 years or so of conflict also meant that many persons of diverse SOGIE have then also been actively involved in the conflict, be it on the side of the state military, but also as volunteers or coerced members of the left-wing FARC and of paramilitaries. And there's some really interesting research around that from Teresa Tuvin that if you're interested in looking at these dynamics, I really recommend that, whereby then you have these combatants who are lesbian or gay or trans and trying to navigate the much more conservative and homophobic, transphobic policies of their armed organizations. And what's also interesting is that in the reintegration processes of ex-combatants, there has been an awareness that the particular needs of diverse SOGIE populations do need to be taken into account in the reintegration process. Colombia is also interesting in terms of transitional justice and LGBTI issues. The Peruvian Truth Commission was the first one to look at sexual orientation and gender identities in the context of transitional justice, but that was relatively minimal. But in Colombia, the National Center for Historical, a very comprehensive, around 500-page study on the experiences of LGBTIQ people during the 6 decades of conflict, and has done particular focused hearings around the trans community's experiences, for example, and produced reports around that. So there's really sort of a wealth of in-depth information there and a willingness to engage with those dynamics, at least amongst some state actors. That said, there are also powerful sort of reactionary forces in that sense. And when the peace agreement was put to a referendum a few years back, the fact that LGBTI issues and sexual orientations and gender identities were in the peace agreement, which was the first as well, and that some of the people involved in that process were openly lesbian women, was used as a mobilizing factor by the opponents of the peace agreement, and unfortunately also quite successfully. So the peace agreement failed to pass the referendum in the first round, to a large point because of this mobilization against so-called gender ideology. And what we're seeing now is then also, unfortunately, a continued or increasing repression of social activists across the spectrum. So killings of indigenous rights activists, land rights activists, of environmental activists, and threats against them, but also against those who are working on gender issues and sort of the mobilization by different kinds of armed groups, be it new paramilitary groups, criminal gangs, breakaways from FARC, really trying to clamp down on all forms of progressive social mobilization in the country. And the last slide. So just to hopefully end on a bit more positive note, because a lot of what I've been saying hasn't been that positive, and that's that by bringing in these diverse SOGIE perspectives, there are new kinds of openings in peace-building processes. So in several cases, there's been the fact that the peace process has to lead to a new kind of reimagining of the state and state-citizen relations has opened up spaces, for example, in Nepal, to have non-binary gender identities accepted and written into the constitution and accepted as identities. In South Africa, the new post-apartheid constitution was the first one to write in sexual orientation and gender identity rights into it. And Colombia, as mentioned, has been sort of a mixed success, with the peace process being one of the first ones to explicitly have these perspectives in there, but that also then leading to a social backlash. Some of the traditional peace-building measures like transitional justice, security sector reform, reintegration of former combatants, they can also be improved and enhanced by bringing in diverse SOGIE perspectives. So there's interesting examples there around the security sector reform in Northern Ireland, or the reintegration of ex-combatants in Colombia, transitional justice, as mentioned, in Colombia and Peru. And also opening up of new spaces for political activism and gender activism around LGBTI issues, and something we've seen in Lebanon through the Syrian refugee response is that also some of the much more traditionally more conservative actors and conservative NGOs, say faith-based organizations in part as well, have then been, by being brought into contact with LGBTI persons and issues, have then become more open to gender issues more broadly and become less homophobic and transphobic, biphobic. And with that, I'll end it there, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Henri, for your very comprehensive and also nuanced lecture.